looking up in awe at a 500-year-old sugar pine. Way up in her canopy, where the birds would sing for her every morning, her needles were changing from green to red. These sugar pines, who live longer than any of you dare dream of living, who provided countless birds and bears and squirrels with food and habitat, and who probably laughed at me as a child when I ran underneath, picking up their giant cones like they were made of gold. These trees were dying by the millions around me. Absolutely heartbroken, I started second-guessing my PhD and whether or not I was asking the right questions. But without an alternate course, I just kept walking, step after step, higher and higher, until the air grew thin and my breath grew rapid. And when I stopped at a lookout, what I saw changed everything. Out there I could see the forest changing from red to green again, and I noticed the chorus of birds and the buzzing of bees, and I realized up here the trees are still alive. For the first time I felt hope, that we still had a chance to protect these high elevation forests from facing the same fate as the sugar pine below. So for the rest of my PhD, I focused on understanding why some of these trees were dying, why some weren't dying, and how we could manage these extreme events moving forward. So I focused on the southern Sierra Nevada, the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And in these areas, there are two major drivers of tree mortality. The biotic drivers are the pests and the pathogens, and the abiotic drivers are the droughts and the fires. And I was particularly interested in a pathogen called white pine blister rust. It's an invasive pathogen. And so when this pathogen arrived 100 years ago, the trees were not adapted to it. It traveled in the air and killed millions of trees over the course of 50 to 100 years. Bark beetles, on the other hand, are native to these forests. They're important components of a healthy forest. But with rising temperatures, their populations are exponentially expanding, causing severe mortality events. So I was looking at this interesting group of white pines. And they're interesting because they range from low to high elevation. At the low elevations, you get the sugar pine. These are the second largest trees in mixed conifer forests, second largest to the giant sequoias, which are the largest trees in the world. They are giants in and of themselves, these sugar pines. A little higher up, you get your western white. And in the subalpine to treeline zones, you find your foxtails and your white bark pines. And these trees are so awesome because they can live for 2,000 years in some of the most extreme conditions known to plants. And all of them are affected by these drivers of mortality. So I got to, over the past 5 years, lead and organize over 40 expeditions into some of the most remote regions of the lower 48. We navigated to long-term monitoring plots and surveyed trees looking for signs of blister rust, beetles, and taking general health assessments. Once we did all this, we carried all of this data back with us out, and we started analyzing it, looking for patterns. But there is no way that I could have accomplished all this without an incredible team behind me. First and foremost, John contacted folks from the National Park Service and set me up with this amazing project. He came out into the field with me and made sure that our protocols were rigorous, and then has helped me along each step to hopefully publishing very soon. I was so lucky to be able to work with park scientists from the USGS and the National Park Service, as well as the forest pathologists and entomologists from the U.S. Forest Service, and some incredible, intrepid crew who are willing to spend 5 to 6 months out of the year hiking in these really extreme conditions. Particularly Sam Zuckerman, Jenny Cribs. They helped me for 3 years on these projects. And then last but not least, I am very lucky to to have an incredible partner who's willing to move out and live in Three Rivers, which is super hot during the summer, while I got to go up into the high elevations where it's much cooler. I would not have survived my first year of research without this guy. And I would not have been able to accomplish as much as I did without this incredible team. So I am so grateful. So once we collected all of these data, we looked for patterns in blister rust and beetle infections or attacks. So beetles are in blue and blister rust is in orange. And you can see that our lower elevation white pine, sugar pine, and western white pine were disproportionately impacted by these biotic agents. In sugar pine, beetles were most abundant, while in western white pine, blister rust was more abundant. This is actually kind of a surprising result. But in high elevations, actually they're much less abundant, which is potentially a good thing, except for with rising temperatures, we expect that both of these populations of pests and pathogens will increase. So when we looked at mortality rates over the last 20 years, what we found was actually pretty concerning for sugar pine. Sugar pine, in some of the plots, almost 80% of our trees had died over the past 20 years. And that translated to about 4% per year. This is super high. So over the past 20 years, sugar pine in the southern Sierra Nevada has been declining. Western white pine, on the other hand, mortality rates are lower, but the recruitment rates are still much lower than mortality, suggesting that this population is pretty unstable. Fortunately, our high elevation white pines are doing relatively well, but again, TBD with climate change. So what do we do? Now we have all these data. How do we deal with these mortality events? Well, it just so happened that I walked into a natural experiment because almost 50% of my sugar pine plots had burned. So I got to ask for the first time whether or not fire could actually help constrain the spread of blister rust. And I found that in fact it can. So when I compared burned and unburned plots, the difference in incidence between those two groups, what I found was on average, the incidence of blister rust was lower in burned plots. So fire can help constrain the spread of blister rust, but it doesn't eliminate blister rust, because this is probably a pretty ephemeral effect. After the fire comes through, the forest starts to recover, and nearby areas can reinfect the trees. But I didn't want to stop there, right? Fire is not a silver bullet. What else can we do? So I started asking scientists and managers in these parks what they thought the best option was. And I started noticing that their answers fell into these three different approaches. The first approach was think about restoration. So we're going to go into areas with high mortality, plant trees, and help the forest recover. The second approach was the opposite. The second approach was like, you know what, this is an extreme natural selection event. Why don't we just wait and see what the forest does? Ideally, the forest that comes back will be more resilient to climate change in the future. While approach C was like, hold up, we are losing some of our iconic species. We can't afford to do that, so let's translocate them to other areas where we think will be more climatically suitable in the future. So I'm just curious about this group. How many of you agree with group one? One, a few people. Actually, that was more than I thought. What about group two? Okay. Okay. How about group three? Maybe a few? All right. What about, who has no idea? That's how I felt. So there's a number of reasons why you probably chose to be in one of those groups. And in the management world, the same goes. There are a number of reasons why we choose these different groups. But I think there are two important ones to consider. And the first is our perceptions of novelty. So what we think about new species, new genes, and new functions in an ecosystem. Group one really wants to constrain and control the amount of novelty in an ecosystem. They want to sustain that historic state. While groups 2 and 3 are much more willing to accept change and novelty in an ecosystem. In fact, they're willing to manipulate it. And that, in part, has to do with how they view risk. So for group 1, the risk of manipulating novelty and creating runaway problems is much worse than the risk that a restoration project fails. While group 3 is like, the risk of losing the species far outweighs anything else. And I'm willing to take on the risk that when we translocate that species, that it'll have negative consequences on that host ecosystem. And so I was like, well, is there some way to objectively decide between these approaches? Is there the right approach? And I took a deep dive into the literature, and I reviewed management plans from around the world, including US, Canada, South Pacific, and New Zealand. And I synthesized all these results in a paper. And what really distilled from this paper was that in order for ecosystems to adapt, some amount of novelty is absolutely critical. It's fundamental to adaptation. And this is really anathema to group 1, right? This has people up in arms. But the thing is, the amount of novelty, the type of novelty, the approaches that you use to encourage novelty, that largely depends on the agency's goals and the problem that you're contending with. So goal setting turns out to be super important. And you're probably like, yeah, we've been making goals for like 200 years plus, you know. This is nothing new. Here's what's new. Making goals in the context of climate change, right? This is a really new challenge that we're confronting. But with clear, articulate goals, we can determine whether or not we want to manage that change or we accept the change, and then which approaches and the risks associated with those approaches we're willing to take on. And it will help us identify how much novelty we actually need to help our ecosystems adapt. Manipulating novelty, encouraging novelty in ecosystems, this is really something new, and it will require a ton of innovation. And we're really not good at it, but we absolutely cannot lose hope, because these global change impacts are not going away anytime soon. And we absolutely depend on these forests for certain ecosystem services. How many in this room depend on the Sierra Nevadas watershed? Everybody! This is a problem for everybody. But my dream is that with effective science and applied science, collaboration, and out-of-the-box thinking, that the next time we go hiking in these forests, hopefully together, the next time and the next time when we reach that mountaintop, we see green foliage spread to the horizon. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Joan. Do we have any questions?